Kia ora, everybody. We'll just start with a cat in the middle of everything because, well, that's just how we roll here. Today's ramble is going to be about protected designation of origin, also known as appellation d'origine contrôlée, AOC. And what this is fundamentally a concept applied to wines, cheeses, beers, stuff like that. It's also present in the Bavarian Purity Act, the Reinschid. I'm not going to get that right. Anyway, it's a horrific German word that requires you to clear your throat and expel one blood when you pronounce it, but it's famously known as the Bavarian Purity Act. And it actually allows a few beers. Famously, beer can only have water, grain, and hops added to it. However, there are a few things like the Goza beer, which has coriander added. Primarily, this was done as a method of controlling beer production, taking it away from women and putting it in the hands of men. That's probably a different argument, but that is how long controlling food goes back to. And the whole idea is about protecting origins. Certain places, such as certain things, were protected as being regionally important. Goza beer, champagne, Bordeaux. Things like this are considered to have an intrinsic value that can only be created by the place they come from. And as I've said earlier, food culture is an intersection between people, time, and place. And it really needs to extend further. Because we all accept that you need to honestly declare where food comes from. You need to honestly state what's in it. And you also need to kind of accurately claim as to what your connection to it is. For nothing else, for the integrity of what you're trying to do. And this brings me to a very interesting thing if you've ever lived in Australia or New Zealand or anywhere that isn't Europe. One of my favourite things to collect is cookbooks that famously state they are from place X when they're kind of not. And so this is kind of going to be a show and tell while I ramble about this. But first I'm going to start off with books from the 1950s that really strike me, that are going to kind of set the tone. And I hope if you bear with me, you'll see why it starts off kind of offensive, but we can get someone good. First up, this guy. This is just a random cookbook from 1950s. It's nothing special. They were sold for the local equivalent of $1. And the whole idea was teaching people, men, because this is 1960s according to the imprint. This is 1941. This is about people who have not been raised to cook. And so it starts off at the absolute basis and moves on and on and on. And then we get something like this from the 1950s. Oh, for a French Wife. It's a similar type of cookbook, but it's talking about making slightly more exciting food. Like, you don't literally need a French wife, as it proudly rambles sexistly in 1950s, to being the original point they're trying to make, that you don't need a French wife, you just need someone that can cook like one, which, okay, cool. I've got a cookbook called If I Was Your Wife, which goes through and has nothing but recipes for cooking for two people, and how to do it well, which I think is an invaluable thing. I'm a little upset that they say if I was your wife, but I suppose if I was your spouse kind of sounds a bit too inclusive for cookbooks, which is a fairly conservative thing. We'll move that one out of the way for a bit. Now we're going to move on to the meat of the issue. And you're going to see why. New Zealand Bacon Cookbook. It's full of European recipes. Guess what? This is also full of European recipes. I need more desk space. Guess what we got here, kids? More European cookbooks. You could take the recipes from there, with the exception of the fish. And you could pull out Heston, you could pull out any number of a bunch of European cookbooks. In fact, if you want to know what most cookbooks that call themselves Australian or New Zealand or Aotearoan or Antipodean, if you want to know what they're cooking, you need to get these. This is an English translation of Escoffier's Le Method. This is a French cookbook standard and is kind of the definitive text for cooking in English. This is Le Rep. This is the definitive guide to traditional French cooking. These two books will contain everything you ever needed to know about any cookbook that declares itself Australian and New Zealand. And that's a thing. And I'm going to keep going because I hate myself. All European, not even any Native Americans, do not expect to find how to grow wild rice, ramps, most kinds of Mesoamerican, Central American, North American beans. Don't expect to see any way on how to encourage the growth of indigenous berries from the Pacific Northwest. Don't expect to see kumara in here. This complete book of everything you would ever want to know, if you're English. If you're English. But it's the definitive guide, apparently. This contains no indigenous ingredients. This is actually a modern book that's in production by a charity, so I'm trying not to show the imprint of it, but this has no indigenous Australian ingredients mentioned in it at all. Not Tasmanian pepperberry, not Dorrigo, mint, lemon myrtle, anise myrtle, strawberry myrtle. It doesn't contain saltbush. These are not even exciting ingredients, but this is a guide to nutritious plants of Tasmania, an island off the coast of mainland Australia, full of things like how to grow spinach, how to grow figs, silver beet, dandelions. That's not Tasmania. That's European imports. This is the same thing in hardcover. In fact, I've got about 4 or 5 of these, all more or less the same colour, all more or less the same thing. The only thing that changes really is the font. As far as I can tell, these have just been recycled since the 1920s. Same Eurocentric information purported to be Australia, New Zealand. Now, you've seen that massive weighty tome of stuff, so let's look at the almost appropriate stuff. This. See how thin this is? This is on traditional Maori ingredients. So is this. You see how big this is? This is a 1970s, I believe, first imprint. 1988. First imprint for this guy. Once again, I'd like to just all the books, all the obscure, weird, black-footed hippie cookbooks. These guys, full of actual useful information, way less than the books from Europe. And I'm going to drag this one out again because I'm just going to keep banging this up. This is the only really serious one. And I hate to use the term seriously, and I don't want to disparage the work that is done by wild foragers, etc. But in particular, when you look at this guy, the field guide, this doesn't tell you how to grow it. This doesn't tell you how to prepare it. This merely tells you if it's toxic or not. It's a survival book. It's a survival book. If you go hiking in New Zealand and you get lost because you're a goddamn idiot and you don't understand that the weather will change on a dime because it's in the South Pacific and it's an island that sticks into a current and so it will suck up weather extremely quickly. i.e., if you pretend you're Europe in New Zealand, you'll need this so you don't die. but that's not going to tell you how to cook with any of these ingredients. And now I'm going to do something more exciting. There is dishes in the Sephardic Jewish tradition. Dafina is the one I'm familiar with, a North African version of it. There's casseroles, cassoules, pies. And these things are dishes that are cooked in an oven. Usually slow cooking. In fact, everybody loves slow cooking at the moment, but where it comes from is community cooking, because most religious organisations, or most religious methods, have one day that is sacred, maybe two. But there is a day of rest, because we're human beings, not organic robots. And what that means is we won't have a day that's a semi-party or a real party. I'm not going to call the Sabbath or Sunday or whatever your day of rest is, but however you want to call it Dave if you want. I'm not going to tell you how Dave works, but it's basically a party. You get together with all your friends during the observance of Dave. And then what happens is you don't really do anything. You chat, have a bit of a party, listen to some dude tell you about the true meaning of Dave, why it's important that we observe Dave, and possibly most important, it gives everyone, during the observance of Dave, to come together as a community, mend, heal, yell at each other, gossip about the people that don't observe Dave, because what kind of person wouldn't observe Dave, yeah? Can't trust him. Can't trust someone that doesn't want to observe Dave. Dave should be observed. Because that's just the right, normal, decent Christian thing to observe Dave. If you don't observe Dave, maybe you're non-observant. That's okay, but I don't know anything about that. But so there's these dishes that get cooked long and slow in a communal, traditionally a baker's oven, because these things are cultural. They're an intersection of time and space, which is what religion is an explanation of the universe based on a time and a place and a people. Like food. And people will kill you for doing the food wrong. Hell, just go to Seattle and tell them that you want your coffee to not taste like ashes and that you want your beer to contain less than 70% pure hops. If you survive the lynching, you'll understand exactly what was going on in medieval Europe, particularly around the observance, non-observance of Dave. Someone's going to be watching this called Dave, and they're going to be so upset. Anyway, I'm sorry, Dave, for all the observation you will be getting, but quite frankly, I think the observation of Dave is a religious and moral duty. Anyway, and so what would happen is traditionally, usually, because the Sabbath, Dave, is a day in which no work can be done through religious observance of Dave. Everything was done the night before, so bakers would bake late into the night, and they would also prepare for the day after the observance of Dave. They would prepare whatever they needed to do for the day after Dave, post Dave Day, that they would be able to continue on, much as without too much of a skipped beat. That's what sourdough bread is. Sourdough bread can be happily left alone for 24 hours to just do its thing. Anyway, these braises, cassoulets, dufina, Sephardic eggs that are slow cooked for 20 odd hours. These things are all put into a cooling baker's oven back when the gathering of firewood and the heat required for baking bread, and this is still observed in some places in Afghanistan, Yemen, Central Asia, all these wonderful places that are currently being bombed back to the Stone Age so we can pay more for petrochemicals. In the tucked away corners of the world where these things are allowed to exist away from a centralized extraction system, there are things like communal ovens that are tended by one group of people, by one family. But in my understanding of the ones I've read about from Afghanistan and North Africa, the family that tends to the communal bakery doesn't gather firewood for it. So what happens is the family that has the bakery is responsible for maintaining it and making sure it's always the appropriate temperature to bake when the bake is ready. and to clean it out and do all that messy little stuff that a whole bunch of people don't really understand you need to do with a communal bakery. But that's their job. And also, eventually there comes a point where there's no point maintaining it because it's just falling apart. They're responsible for tearing it down and building a new one. But they don't gather the firewood for it. That is not their responsibility. The community takes that responsibility upon them. It's a type of specialisation. And usually these people the family will also be bakers for people that can't bake. Widowers, widows, the old, the infirm, the orphans, they are taken care of by the communal bakers. And as much as there's a part of me that wants to stand up and go, anarchy works, this is not anarchy. This is what the community does. This is what we are as people. We are a fluid-filled snack for anything that comes along that has claws, jaws, and a bad attitude. The only way we get to survive and thrive is by being a hive. We work as a community because that's how we're wired up. Other people, Gnome the Barbarian on Twitter, for example, mentions that we are so empathetic. I think other people have made this observation as well. It's a pretty obvious observation, to be fair, but he's the face I saw it first. In writing, as opposed to just a feeling you have in your guts. We are so wired up to work together as a group that we will see a small machine that we made. We will see a face on it, and we will assign emotions to an automatic vacuum cleaner. People talk about their Roombas legitimately like they've got feelings. That's how much we, as human beings, that's how important community is to us. Another thing I read recently was interdependence is not the problem. And it isn't. That's the only way we survive. There's this big push in the West, in Western thought, to be a strong, independent, lone wolf type person. They're all dead. Do you know what happens if you go lone wolfing into the Alaskan wilderness? You die. Today, tomorrow, you die. You don't survive. You don't get to come up with new and exciting words. You don't develop a religion. You don't build a society. You die. You try and sail solo across the Pacific with no idea of what you're doing and no idea where any islands are. You die. You try and cross Australia solo. You die. Climb up the Himalayas solo. Guessing you're going to start to see a pattern here. Cross Europe on foot. Today, do it seriously. Just go for a walk today. You'll probably get COVID. Don't. Sorry, bad joke. In happier times, attempt to cross Europe on foot with only your own resources. Odds are you will not make it. And I mean your own resources. So when you get sick, you don't get to go to hospital. You don't get to ask people for help. I mean, you 100% go it. The alpha male, He-Man, macho stupidity that people have been sold through John Wayne movies and other ignorance. Go 100% solo. Doesn't work. In fact, think of the most masculine, hyper, psychotic organisation you can. For me, that's the Royal Australian Army, 4th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. Now they're 2 Commando. Anyway, Special Forces soldiers. The toughest, most dangerous things ever. Go read their survival manuals. Almost all of them will say your chances of survival as an individual are negligible. Highly trained, highly fit, dedicated, motivated individuals. As a singular entity by themselves, they are a rounding error when it comes to survival. Which is why communal cooking exists, and that is why things like the communal, it is how we are designed to be. We need to be in an organisation. We need to be part of something larger than ourselves, because we cannot master the skills required to survive on our own. We cannot stay awake for 24 hours a day. We can't do all the things that we need to survive in a world that basically sees us as a block of chocolate. Which is why things like the cassoulet, the Defina, pot au feu, which is a classic one. It's an old chicken, dried up piece of pork, usually a trotter, and leftover piece of beef boiled in a pot. Add vegetables if you got them, not necessarily traditional. The oldest recipes for a pot au feu use water, not stock. Use soured wine or vinegar. You know, leftover stuff. Fondue is a classic example of using leftover stuff. All these things exist to try and stretch survival for a little bit longer and a little bit further than they necessarily can be on their own. And they all require infrastructure. And that leads me, in a roundabout way, back to why I am so angry and upset that all these cookbooks purporting to be for a certain region, in spite of the fact the world accepts the protected designation of origin as a thing that is important to food, that it is important in things like Le Repertoire, where it reads, it says that, you know, if you're going to make a Bordelaise sauce, this is what you put in a Bordelaise sauce, you don't put anything else. If you're going to make a Hollandaise, you don't use blood orange juice as your acid, because if you do, it becomes a Maltese. Same thing, but base of it is blood orange juice instead of vinegar. Still cooked exactly the same, everything else exactly the same, except you're substituting one ingredient, changes the entire name. That kind of matters. And it's accepted to matter in European things, or things that are important to Europeans, chocolate and coffee in particular. Oh, vanilla beans as well, I guess. Things that are important to Europeans get protected, and get protected legally. If you're BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, Person of Colour, or just one of the people whose many names just mean the people, Maori, Kanaka Malloy, Tahitians, Samoans, etc., the things that are important to you do not get protected because they are not European. They are not seen worthy of protection, which is why in the year 2020 you can find books for cooking in Australia, doing ingredients. Unfortunately, I put them in a pile, so I'm not going to pull them back out, where people will proudly say, this is how you cook things from Tasmania, and not mention a single Indigenous ingredient. That's how you get New Zealand declaring its favourite dessert to be vanilla slice. Millefeuille. It's French, but it's considered New Zealand. It's New Zealand's favourite dessert. Australia and New Zealand will fight over the lamington. Who cares? You know, like, it's a sponge cake dipped in chocolate and covered in coconut. It's about... It is as traditional to the Pacific Ocean as Captain Cook was. And quite frankly, he was an Uber driver, and he inspired such intense loyalty from his men that they left him to die by people they thought were cannibals. That's how much they loved Captain Cook. The crew that knew him left him to die. Which is my whole point. We're still sitting here 180 years, and we are so heavily colonised that the only way you can learn as to what ingredients are native and indigenous to New Zealand are a survival manual and a pamphlet. It's frustrating and angry. It's frustrating and it makes me angry. And unfortunately, I don't get to show my anger, because if I do, I'm just another angry islander. If I was English, I could go complete Gordon Ramsay and throw stuff around and have an authentic expression of anger, which is one of those things. But closing thought should probably be, why don't we want to protect New Zealand cooking? Why don't we express understanding and amazement at the fact that there were food larders built in New Zealand that I can only find passing mention of, that were basically a stone beehive with an open top, but they kept food 20 Celsius below ambient temperature. Just just think about that. For those that don't understand science or refrigeration, the Kelvinator, Simpson, Fisher and Paykel, whatever refrigerator you have at home, is currently keeping the food that you eat at approximately 20 degrees below ambient temperature. If you're like me in Brisbane at the moment and you're experiencing 40 Celsius degree days, yeah, it's 30 degrees below ambient. But we're talking about a pile of rocks made by Stone Age people who buried or burnt their food to just pull out all the racist stuff, who had such an intense understanding of both wind and architecture and material science that they were able to make a pile of rocks keep food at the appropriate temperature for long-term storage, as well as a refrigerator. That I can't find that in any cookbook. That's not mentioned. That significantly changes everything that is known about, that should change everything that is known and understood about Maori cooking. Just that one fact. Because now you can keep fish fresh for 3 days with these things. And like I said, I only know of them through one freaking source. And so I don't know how widespread they were. There is no mention of them. But this is the biggest change to worldwide trade was refrigeration. Refrigerated ships, pretty much an Australian invent. Well, Europeans in Australia kind of gave that to the world. Refrigerated shipping, and it changed the world. It meant that Australia and New Zealand could become the breadbasket of the empire, far enough away from Europe. They were at no risk of being invaded, but they could feed England and allow England to change its entire economy to a war footing, because they would always be able to get fresh food sent by ship. Yet a bunch of, once again to quote the English racists, Stone Age primitives were able to make effective refrigeration out of rocks. It's like the whole counting in binary system. Once again, the first contact was not done by people that understood anything other than the words they read in a book about Jesus, which is cool. But Jesus didn't know shit about cooking. Otherwise, he would have known that you don't turn water into wine. You turn wine into water. It's better for you. And there's the old joke about, well, he turned water into Syrian wine, so it's not much of a trick, really. Anyway, that's probably enough teasing of people about religion. There is a massive lack of understanding of serious study of cooking in the Pacific at a practical level. I can't look at academic texts because I don't have tens of thousands of dollars to spend on subscriptions to get to it. So I am relying on the stuff that is released for the tradesmen in the field. Me. Guys like me, cooks. And it's all stuff that comes from Europe. And there is no reason for that. I feel that there needs to be an appellation de original contrôlée for the Pacific. In general, I think our food needs to be taken more seriously than the French, because quite frankly, the French at one point were so desperate for food they were eating snails. I don't know about you, but if you've got a full fridge, you don't wake up, look at a snail crawling through your lettuce and go, I reckon I'll eat the snail instead of the lettuce. That's food of desperation. I don't know if you've ever really been hungry or ever really been poor, but the best ideas don't come from desperation. They come from intelligent people who are comfortable trying to maintain a level of comfort. And I think that's why it's so important to remember that things like coming up with a larder made out of stone that is 20 degrees cooler, that speaks to being comfortable enough in your food supply being secure enough and rich enough that you can 100% spend time in trial and error making this, and the wasted food from that trial and error is not going to kill you off, because that's what it takes to invent a fridge. Experimentation. Nobody gets things right the first time. So it was a thing that was deliberately made to keep a surplus. but you have to be pretty rich to have that surplus. And that is why I think there is a lot. That's why I think things like that happened. Why freshwater fermentation was done in the islands, because there was so much food. Such wealthy people who are able to trade in peace instead of pulling the Viking thing and being so desperate for food and resources that they actually have to get into a boat half-starved, armed with a sword, and start killing people to get things. You have people that are like, well, let's just load up a bunch of whatever will keep the longest and sail that way till we hit South America and see if they've got anything interesting to trade. Oh, sweet, they've got sweet potato, kumara. Well, let's just trade some of what we've got for some of what they've got. Let's head home. And then you're not eating the kumara to get it back to the islands. Once again, that's pointing to people that have a high enough surplus of food that they can send out trading missions that are well stocked enough that they don't have to eat the trade food that they got. They can successfully bring it back. Anyway, hopefully this all ties together and isn't just some anti-colonial rant against Europe, although I'm not really going to review it because I don't really like reviewing these because I don't like the sound of my voice, and yes, I realise that's a thing that everybody has, but this is my channel and I don't have to review things if I don't want to. Anyway guys, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.